In 711, a Muslim army crossed from North Africa into Spain and proceeded to conquer most of the peninsula. In 1212, a coalition Christian army decisively defeated the last great Muslim power on the Iberian Peninsula, the Almohads. Finally, in 1492, the Catholic monarchs of Aragon and Castile subdued Granada, the last Muslim holdout on the southeastern sliver of the peninsula. This long period of history encompasses one of the truly great contests of the Middle Ages, the battle for Spain, waged between Muslim and Christian powers. Thus, the history of medieval Iberia has become almost legendary as the Reconquista, beginning with the Muslim invasion in 711 and finally concluding with the fall of Granada in 1492. The Reconquista coincides with many key developments over the whole of medieval history. The first phase, from 711 to 1031, was an era of almost unquestioned Muslim dominance, in which the emirs and caliphs of Cordoba were the hegemonic power on the peninsula. This echoes the broader flourishing and triumph of Islamic civilization across the Mediterranean world during the early Middle Ages. The second phase, from 1031 to 1212, saw the rise of the northerly Christian states, which recaptured considerable territories from the Muslims and presented a real existential threat to the remaining Islamic regions. Meanwhile, militant Berber movements from North Africa gave the Christians a run for their money, fighting back and gaining crucial successes. This mirrors wider developments, with the Latin Christian West on the rise across Europe, and the Muslim world suddenly faced with a powerful and expanding competitor. The third phase, from 1212 to 1492, was an era of Christian hegemony, beginning with a mopping up of the great swathe of the Muslim lands during the mid-13th century. After this, a small Muslim territory held out in the Emirate of Granada, which endured for 2 more centuries before finally being liquidated by Isabel of Castile and Fernando of Aragon. Here now, the Spanish situation doesn't reflect so neatly with more general developments. In the Holy Land, a newly triumphant Islam was defeating the Crusades, while the Ottoman Turks were beginning their long history as a great world power. Without question, the history of the Arab conquest and the subsequent Reconquista greatly impacted the broader character of the nations that would become Spain and Portugal. It's a fascinating story, and we will cover it in full in this series. The Iberian Peninsula, when the Arabs conquered it in AD 711, could already boast a long and rich history. Saint Isidore of Sevilla, one of the most influential figures of the early medieval church and a giant of Visigothic literature, wrote in AD 624, "Of all the lands from the west to the Indies, you, Spain, O sacred and always fortunate mother of princes and peoples, are the most beautiful. Rightly are you now the queen of all provinces, from which not only the west but also the east borrows its shining lights. You are the pride and the ornament of the world, the most illustrious part of the earth, in which the Gothic people are gloriously prolific, rejoicing much and flourishing greatly. Iberians, Celts, Carthaginians, and Greeks had all settled Spain long before the Romans began their conquest in 218 BC. The Roman impact proved enduring. Spain became Latin in its language, law, and culture. During the days of the Roman peace, a massive network of roads was established and the economy flourished. This resulted in a thriving urban civilization. With Romanization came Christianization. The religion of Christ came to dominate Spain in the late Roman era and would endure as a powerful force from then on. At the start of the century, Vandals, Alans, and Suevi occupied the south, west, and north, visiting war and destruction on the Hispano-Romans, who seemed incapable of defending themselves. By the century's end, the Visigoths, the most vigorous of the Germanic tribes to enter Spain, settled in Old Castile, where their legacy has echoed ever since in the local genetics, language, and place names. Over time, they subdued the other tribes and took control of the remaining Roman outposts. Finally, in the 7th century, their rule extended across the peninsula. The great failure of the Visigoths was their inability to establish a hereditary succession. Civil war was a constant feature of their rule and played a key role in the rather rapid collapse of the kingdom to the Muslim invaders. The Visigoths remained a minority of perhaps 200,000 to 300,000, ruling over a Hispano-Roman population of some 6 to 9 million. Under such conditions, the conquered exerted considerable influence over the conqueror. The Germanic Visigoths, who admired Roman civilization, became thoroughly Latinized. Visigothic kings emulated the old Roman emperors, and the Visigothic chieftains took on the role of Hispano-Roman aristocrats. The persistence of the term Hispania for the region, rather than a Germanic name, is testimony to the enduring Latin influence. Most Visigoths became peasant farmers in the Upper Duero Valley, using old Germanic names like Alfonso and Fernando, singing their epic poems and maintaining their customary laws. In other places, Roman systems endured virtually unchanged. However, Muslim and Vandal piracy broke down the ancient Mediterranean trade routes, and the Visigothic kings found it difficult to unify their subject peoples. During this period, a claim to Visigothic blood was a marker of high status, and also highlighted social divisions. The most troublesome obstacle to Visigothic rule in the peninsula was religion. The Visigoths were Arians, and the vast majority of their subjects followed the Orthodox Catholic Rite of Rome. The issue was finally resolved in 587, when the Visigothic king announced his conversion to Catholicism. At the death of King Regisvinth in 672, Visigothic Spain was at the height of its development. The peninsula was united, religious conflict had been overcome, and cultural achievements were higher than those of any other post-Roman Germanic successor state. Yet, the government still grappled with essential weaknesses. Previous kings had tried but failed to make the monarchy hereditary. The crown remained elective, encouraging rebellion and feuding among the nobles. After the death of Regisvinth, the bishops and magnates were eager to prevent the late king's family from making a bid for the throne, and so they gathered immediately for an election. The crown was granted to Vamba, but just as he assumed the throne, rebellion erupted in Septiminia. The new king dispatched Duke Paul to quell the uprising, but the duke instead made common cause with the rebels and proclaimed himself king. Vamba was dealing with a Basque revolt in the north when he heard of Duke Paul's betrayal. At once he moved on Septimania and succeeded in defeating the duke, who was condemned to lifelong imprisonment. Vamba's success had almost been thwarted by the old bane of Spain's Visigothic kings, a difficulty in raising troops. The nobles were often reluctant or downright hostile to supporting their king in the field, and the peasants were disinterested in the endless civil wars. To remedy the situation, Vamba decreed that all nobles, freemen, and clergy were bound by law to answer a summons from the king. This was the revival of an old custom, but it was greatly resented by the clergy as well as the nobility. Vamba had shown impressive energy during his reign, which ended abruptly in 680 when the king fell ill. The courtiers assumed he was dying. In keeping with Visigothic custom, Julian, Bishop of Toledo, tonsured the king and clothed him in penitential garb. Some sources describe the whole affair as a plot hatched by Bishop Julian and Ervig, a grandnephew of the late King Kindisvinth. Vamba recovered and found himself legally deprived of the right to rule, and so he renounced the throne to Ervig. Ervig's crowning was not accepted by the whole of the Visigothic elite. To combat doubts about his legitimacy, he summoned a council in Toledo in 681 under Bishop Julian. The council released all of the Spanish magnates from their obligations to Vamba. Ervig tried to neutralize any remaining resistance by marrying his daughter to Vamba's nephew, Ekika, whom Ervig named as his successor. But no sooner had Ervig died that Ekika repudiated Ervig's daughter and renounced his alliance with the late king's family. He then set about punishing all those that he suspected of treachery, hardening resistance among Ervig's faction. Ekika made a bid to secure his own family as the monarchy's hereditary bloodline. He named his son Witiza his heir and promoted his family to key power positions. This aroused resentment, which was compounded when Witiza proved a poor ruler, concerned primarily with carrying on affairs with women. We can see then how the Visigothic monarchy, in its final years, was in a truly poor state. The chronic factionalism and civil conflict culminated with the disastrous reign of Witiza. This vindictive, hedonistic, and ineffective king's rule came to an end in 710. The next year, North African armies would destroy completely the Visigothic state. The story of how all this came about makes for one of the most intriguing and confusing chapters in Spanish history. Witiza, king of Visigothic Spain, died in 710, having spent much of his reign attempting to solidify a hereditary monarchy. His son, Aquila, was proclaimed king in the northeast, but most of the nobles opposed this. Witiza's opponents controlled the royal city of Toledo, and they recognized Roderick, grandson of the late King Kindisfin, as the new monarch of the Visigothic realm. Witiza's faction seemed defeated, but rather than accept the situation and recognize Roderick, they attempted to find another route to the throne. One strategy they employed was dispatching messengers to the Muslims of Africa, asking for assistance in staging a rebellion. For centuries, the enigmatic Count Julian has figured prominently in accounts of the Arab conquest of Spain. His exact identity remains mysterious. Arab chronicles of the events mention him, but Christian accounts do not. Various modern writers have identified him as a Byzantine exarch governing Ceuta on the coast of North Africa, as a Christian Berber who defended Tangier against the Arabs, or as a Gothic nobleman with lands on the Spanish side of the Straits of Gibraltar. None of these can be confirmed or entirely discounted. The Arab chroniclers identify him as an opponent of the last Visigothic king of Spain, Roderick. They claim that the Count's opposition began after his daughter was ravished by the king. Thus, Julian contacted the Muslims of North Africa and plotted with them to overthrow the Visigoths. Regardless of the truth of this backstory, the Iberian Peninsula was naturally attractive to the long triumphant Arabs. Having so rapidly expanded across North Africa, Spain was a logical destination for Islam. With their numbers bolstered by the newly converted Berbers, the Muslims of the Maghreb were in a powerful position. Count Julian may have defended Tangier from them in 708, only to be forced to acknowledge their overlordship in 709. That same year, Julian apparently conducted a reconnaissance of the Spanish mainland, reporting back to the Arabs that the peninsula was poorly defended and beset by civil conflict. Whatever the case, North Africa's Muslim governor, Musa ibn Nusayr, consulted the Caliph of Damascus on the idea of an invasion. The Caliph recommended caution. Musa assigned Tarif ibn Maluk to conduct an exploratory expedition. In July 710, Tarif led 400 men across the Straits of Gibraltar. They landed on the coast of Tarifa, which to this day bears his name. After raiding Algeciras, Tarif crossed back to Africa with considerable booty and a promising report. Musa wanted to learn more. After some months, he organized a far larger expeditionary force of 7,000, led this time by Tariq ibn Ziyad. Between April 27 and 28 of 711, Tariq landed on the Rock of Gibraltar, which he gave his name. At the time, Roderick, king of the Visigoths, was campaigning in Basque territory. When he heard of the southern invasion, he rushed to Cordoba and gathered an army. Tariq reacted with admirable caution. Rather than press inland and expose his army to attack, he remained at Algeciras. Reinforcements arrived from Africa, increasing his army to a total of around 12,000 troops. Soon after, King Roderick's host faced off against Tariq's invasion force at the Battle of Guadalete. The date was July 19, 711. Roderick had the numerical advantage, but his coalition was not sound. Sispert and Oppas, members of Witiza's faction, commanded the wings of Roderick's army, and during the battle, they pulled back and retired, leaving Roderick's center to face the Muslims alone. According to some sources, Sispert and Opus were in contact with Tariq and planned this betrayal ahead of time. The Visigoths were entirely routed. Roderick himself was lost in the fighting. Afterward, the Muslims found the fallen king's white steed, adorned with a golden saddle, studded with rubies and emeralds. The battle-hardened Berbers fought with unity and undaunted spirit. For Tariq, the victory was total. By this single battle alone, the Visigothic monarchy was essentially wiped out. Witiza's sons were mistaken if they believed their betrayal would gain them the throne. Islam had triumphed, and with it, a new order arose. Tariq understood that he had smashed the head of the Visigothic establishment. His mission, originally meant as a reconnaissance, was now poised to capture Spain. This was one of the truly great victories in the history of Islam. The fractured state of the Visigothic monarchy left little institutional strength to resist the Arab invaders. With Roderick dead, the fragile state all but collapsed, and the Muslims were able to expand their control of the peninsula fairly quickly. Near Écija, Tariq defeated the remnants of the Visigothic army, then dispatched forces to seize Córdoba and to ravage and plunder the territories around Granada and Malaga. He then marched on Toledo, where much of the citizenry, including the archbishop, had fled in a panic. At his arrival, he encountered no significant opposition, and Toledo passed into Muslim hands. The Arab sources provide elaborate descriptions of all the wealth and gold found by Tariq's men in the city. Included among the booty was an ancient solid gold table, ornamented with jewels, reported to have once adorned the Temple of Solomon. The chronicler, Ibn Abd al-Hakam, describes the scene. The table was valued at 200,000 dinars because of its precious stones. Tariq took all the jewels, armor, gold, silver, and plate he found there, and besides that acquired wealth such as had not been seen before. The local Hispano-Roman population, demoralized by long years of Visigothic infighting, offered little resistance, as Berber contingents subdued the countryside. Tariq rewarded Witiza's sons by granting them their ancestral estates. Other Visigothic nobles sought similar deals. In the past, the Visigothic nobility had frequently feuded over the crown, and the kingdom lacked the structure for regional resistance to a determined invader. Thus, the nobles mostly did what they'd done in the past, tried to cut deals, grasping at what they could of the spoils after disaster. Except this time, they made deals with the Arab conquerors, rather than with a rival ruling dynasty. Now, when it was too late, the chronic ailments of the Visigothic state were all too obvious. Meanwhile, back in North Africa, Musa was enraged by Tariq's success. He dispatched a mission of reconnaissance, not conquest, and he viewed Tariq's subjugation of Spain as an act of defiance. He feared the Berber chieftain would try to set himself up as Spain's independent ruler. This was a dark omen, forecasting centuries of internal conflict among Spain's Muslim powers, which would endure until the last emirs were defeated in the 15th century. Assembling an army of 18,000 Arabs, Musa crossed the Straits of Gibraltar in June of 712, arriving at Algeciras. Immediately, he targeted towns that Tariq had bypassed. Sevilla fell to him after a siege of several months. He then pressed on to Merida, where he encountered fierce resistance from Visigothic nobles. The Visigoths held out through the winter, but finally surrendered in June of 713. A Visigothic nobleman called Duke Theodomer agreed to terms with Musa. The details of their agreement have survived, shedding light on similar deals struck between Visigothic elites and the Muslim conquerors. Musa granted Theodomer rule over his duchy, promising not to harm his subjects or their churches. In return, Theodomer and his followers were not to harm the Muslims or help their enemies or harbor fugitives. Theodomer agreed to pay an annual tribute. Finally, Musa moved on Toledo. Near Talavera, he encountered Tariq, whom he struck on the head with his riding crop, upbraiding him for greed, rebelliousness, and disobedience. It must have been unsettling to many of the troops to witness the public humiliation of Spain's great conqueror at the hands of his overlord. And yet, Musa and Tariq seemed to set aside their differences. They settled together in Toledo and dispatched messengers to the Caliph in Damascus to inform him of the miraculous conquest of Spain. In 714, Musa was in Zaragoza, consolidating Muslim control of the region, when he received a summons from the Caliph. He was to report to Damascus at once. Musa may have been unnerved by such a command, but he dared not disobey. That summer, he left his son Abd al-Aziz to govern Spain and made the journey across North Africa. Wearing golden crowns and bearing an immensity of booty and slaves from Spain, Musa and Tariq arrived at the great Muslim capital. There, the Caliph stripped Musa of his honors, charging him with corruption. The Caliph was so enraged, he nearly had Musa crucified, but he settled instead with fining the unfortunate governor heavily. Neither of Spain's Muslim conquerors would ever again see their cherished prize. Both would die in Syria, in obscurity, a strange end for the men who'd achieved one of the truly outstanding triumphs in the history of Islam. Spain was now a part of the Dar al-Islam, and Córdoba would shine as one of the epicenters of Muslim civilization. Al-Andalus was the name given by the Arabs to this new territory they'd captured. However, the Muslims never managed to subdue the whole of the peninsula. Far to the north, Christian resistance would solidify around a daring and defiant Visigothic nobleman, Pelayo of the Asturias. The bold actions of this Pelayo would ensure the survival of Christian sovereignty in a remote outpost and would launch the centuries-long struggle known as the Reconquista. After the Umayyad conquest of Spain, known as Al-Andalus to the Muslims, the Caliph in Damascus took steps to ensure that the peninsula would remain under his control. He wanted to prevent an ambitious Muslim adventurer from setting himself up as an independent king of Al-Andalus. In 715, he had his men assassinate Musa's son, Abd al-Aziz, in the Mosque of Sevilla. From now on, the Caliph appointed governors, emirs, directly and only for brief terms. These emirs enforced Umayyad rule in regions where Musa had only made a show of force. This allowed the Umayyads to dominate essentially all of the Iberian Peninsula. Only one region effectively resisted Muslim rule, the Asturian Mountains in the north. The legal status of the conquered was determined by religion. According to Islamic law, Christians and Jews were considered people of the book, those who had received some divine revelation through sacred writings. These two groups were not compelled to convert. In return, they were required to submit to Umayyad rule and pay a poll tax, known as the jizya, to the Muslim authorities. Those that had capitulated were often allowed to retain their lands. Those who had been subdued by force were deprived of their property and could be reduced to slavery. Confiscated lands as well as church and state properties were divided among the Muslim elite, with 1/5 being reserved for the Caliph himself. Christians subject to Muslim rule began to adopt some of the customs of the Arabs. They came to be called Mozarabs, that is, like Arabs. Mozarab communities existed in Toledo, Córdoba, Sevilla, Mérida, and other cities. They were governed by their bishops, who were accountable to the Muslim administrators. Over time, many Christians and Jews converted to Islam. Converts and their children were no longer subject to the jizya tax. Thus, the Muslim authorities were often less than enthusiastic about conversions. Slaves could also gain freedom by converting. However, the descendants of converts were long held in contempt by the original class of Arab conquerors. For many years, only those related to the first Muslim settlers were eligible for the highest positions in society and government. During this early period, the Umayyads of Spain began penetrating into France. At the time, France was ruled by the decadent Merovingian dynasty, soon to be usurped by the Carolingian Franks under Charles Martel. By 717, the Muslims ruled Barcelona, from which armies could more easily be launched across the Pyrenees. Narbonne fell to the Umayyads in 720. From there, the Muslims raided as far as Toulouse, though in 721 they were defeated while battling Odo, Duke of Aquitaine. 4 years later, the Muslims captured Carcassonne and even plundered into Burgundy. From the days of Tariq and Musa, Muslim garrisons held fortresses in the upper reaches of the Iberian Peninsula. But in the remote stretches of the Central Pyrenees, Umayyad rule could scarcely penetrate. Amid the crags of the northwest, Christian rebels congregated. These were Visigoths fleeing Umayyad domination, as well as the mountaineers of Cantabria and Galicia. Together, these tough and resilient warriors would lay the groundwork for the upstart kingdom of Asturias and the future Reconquista of Spain. The first leader of this Christian resistance was a Visigothic nobleman called Pelayo. Our earliest sources for his life are sparse, and he remains a figure of obscure origin. Supposedly, he was a grandnephew of King Roderick. Later accounts claimed that he was born of the royal house, but this may have been an attempt to establish the Asturian kingdom as the valid successor state to the extinct Visigothic monarchy. More than likely, Pelayo was simply a motivated and daring nobleman who threw up the banner of rebellion and rallied a band of Christian warriors to his cause. An account of Pelayo's uprising comes to us from a late source, the 9th century chronicle of Alfonso III. The chronicle describes Pelayo as the sword-bearer of the Visigothic kings. Apparently, Pelayo, like many Visigothic nobles, had submitted to Munuza, one of Tariq's lieutenants, and the governor of Gijón. Munuza became attracted to Pelayo's sister, and so he dispatched Pelayo to Córdoba on a diplomatic mission. After Pelayo set off on this journey, Munuza took Pelayo's sister as one of his wives. When Pelayo heard of this, he was enraged. At once, he renounced his submission to the Umayyads, gathered a band of rebels around himself, and struck off into the mountains to launch a resistance. Since it comes to us from a later account, this story cannot be confirmed nor entirely discounted. Historians have often noted that it seems too good a tale to be true, and if it is not entirely legendary, it might contain later embellishments. But then again, if we were to discover one day that the tale was indeed based in fact, it wouldn't be the first legend that surprised us for being factual. What history does confirm is that sometime in the first years after the Arab conquest, Pelayo launched a Christian rebellion in the Asturian mountains, and the Umayyads took actions to crush him. The emir launched an expeditionary force to the north, led by the general Alcama, accompanied by Bishop Oppas of Sevilla, one of the Visigoths who betrayed Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete. The Chronicle of Alfonso III provides details of the encounter, though our understanding of the battle that followed remains obscure. Pelayo and his forces took a position at a cave on Mount Alceva. There, they were surrounded by the Muslim army. Alcama sent Bishop Oppas to negotiate with Pelayo. Oppas urged Pelayo to surrender, insisting that he would be rewarded with great riches if only he submitted to the Umayyads. Pelayo refused. Alcama now launched his forces against Pelayo's men, and the battle began. There, amid the steep ledges and crags, the Christian mountaineers overcame their attackers. Defeated, the Muslims fled through the treacherous terrain. Pelayo's men gave chase, slaying many of them. Many of Alcama's troops were killed in an avalanche or drowned in the river. Alcama himself was slain, and Bishop Oppas was captured. Munuza abandoned his forts in the Asturias, and Pelayo's rule was confirmed in the region. He established a shrine to the Virgin Mary at Covadonga, where a church still stands today in her honor. This is our most detailed account of the Battle of Covadonga, won by Pelayo in 722. Again, the details of the battle come to us from a later source, the Chronicle of Alfonso III. However, the basic details of the events, a Christian rebellion in the Cantabrian mountains, led by Pelayo and resulting in the establishment of the Asturian kingdom, are supported by a charter from 812, the prophetic chronicle of 883, and Muslim sources as well. Ibn Hayyan tells us that the Christians of Spain did not resist the Umayyads until stirred up by, quote, a despicable barbarian named Pelai, who fled with his followers to a high mountain, where they fed on wild honey. Isa ibn Ahmad al-Razi gives virtually the same account, and there are other Muslim authors who describe similar events. Muslim historians from the period gloss over Pelayo's victory at Cappadocia, stating merely that the Muslim troops had difficulty penetrating the mountains, and so they withdrew, leaving Pelayo and his men to hold the region. One Muslim chronicler dismisses Pelayo's rebellion as insignificant, writing, "What are 30 barbarians perched on a rock? They must inevitably die." In hindsight, this dismissal strikes us as foolish. Not only would Pelayo survive, but his kingdom would expand and in time drive the Muslims out of Spain entirely. And yet, we can understand how the Muslim chroniclers of the early period would hold these Christian upstarts in contempt. The Umayyad emirs of Cordoba scarcely thought it worth their time to take note of this tiny Christian principality in the mountainous north. Pelayo's victory at Cappadocia had been a setback, but a minor one only. By the close of the 8th century, the Muslims dominated the vast sweep of Spain, and Pelayo's heirs in the Asturias still seemed unimportant. To the east of Pelayo's lands, one Duke Pedro ruled Cantabria. His son, Alfonso, married Pelayo's daughter, Ermesinda, uniting the two realms. Civil war among the Umayyads prompted the Berbers to abandon the northern plains in 741. This allowed Pelayo's son-in-law, Alfonso I of Asturias, to drive southward as far as Coria. By 754, Alfonso captured all the towns abandoned by the Berber garrisons across the broad plains of the Duero, as far south as Salamanca, Avila, and Segovia, and as far east as Miranda de Ebro. However, Alfonso was concerned that he wouldn't be able to hold these towns in the event of a Muslim counterattack. And so, he devastated the region, burning all the fortifications, and taking the local Christians back with him to his northern domain. Thus, Alfonso left to his south some hundreds of square miles of devastated territory. For centuries, the Duero Valley would remain a no-man's land, dividing the Christian and Muslim domains. In the early years after the Arab conquest of Spain, the Umayyads maintained a toehold in Lower France, centered around Septimania. But frequent turnover of the emirs in Cordoba precluded the Muslims paying much serious attention to the land beyond the Pyrenees. But finally, in 732, the emir Abd al-Rahman assembled a large army at Pamplona. First, the emir defeated a Muslim rebel, Munuza, in the mountains of the eastern Pyrenees. Munuza had sought help from Duke Odo of Aquitaine, and al-Rahman decided to march north to punish the Duke. With his troops, the emir crossed the pass of Roncesvalles into France. He defeated Duke Odo on the banks of the Garonne. Determined to continue the pursuit, al-Rahman sacked Bordeaux and then burned the famous church of St. Hilary at Poitiers. The emir now pressed northward along the old Roman road, intending to sack the shrine of Saint Martin at Tours on the Loire. While advancing on the road between Poitiers and Tours, al-Rahman came face to face with Charles Martel and his Franks. Charles was responding to a plea for assistance from Duke Odo. Martel was a veteran commander, and his warriors had honed their skills in years of campaigning. He was an opponent very much unlike the ill-disciplined Visigoths the Umayyads had faced in Spain. Our earliest accounts of the battle that raged that day between the Umayyads and the Franks come to us from the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754. It was written in Spain in the 2 decades following the events, and seems to have been based primarily on the testimonies of Muslim veterans from the campaign. This is the account given by the Chronicle. After each side had tormented the other for almost 7 days with raids, they finally prepared their battle lines and fought fiercely. The northern peoples remained immobile like a wall, holding together like a glacier in the cold regions, and in the blink of an eye, annihilated the Arabs with the sword. The Franks, greater in number of soldiers and formidably armed, killed the emir Abd al-Rahman when they found him, striking him on the chest. But suddenly, within sight of the countless tents of the Arabs, the Franks despicably put up their swords, saving themselves to fight the next day, since night had fallen during the battle. Rising from their own camp at dawn, the Franks saw the tents of the Arabs all arranged according to their canopies, just as the camp had been set up before. Not knowing that they were all empty and thinking that inside them were phalanxes of Saracens ready for battle, they sent scouts to reconnoiter and discovered that all the troops of the Arabs had left. They had all fled silently by night in tight formations, returning to their own country. The Franks, worried lest the Saracens deceitfully attempt to ambush them in hidden paths, were slow to react and searched in vain everywhere around. Having no intention of pursuing the Saracens, they took the spoils and the booty, which they divided up fairly, back to their country and were overjoyed. This is the brief description of the battle. It comes to us from the Mozarabic text, written in Al-Andalus. Our earliest Frankish source, from the continuator of Fredegar, is even more laconic. Here is that excerpt. Prince Charles boldly deployed his troops against the Arabs, and, warrior that he is, fell upon them. With Christ's help, he pulled down their tents, rushing into battle to grind them to pieces. And when he had prostrated and killed their emir, Abd al-Rahman, he defeated their forces, and so he triumphed, a victor over his enemies. These two early accounts are brief, but they do provide us with crucial information about the battle. It's clear that the Franks were not employing cavalry in any great numbers. Charles Martel's force was composed mainly of infantry. He arrayed them in a strong shield wall on high ground with a river on their flank. Martel selected the terrain for his stand well, and the Mozarab author's image of a glacier is a powerful metaphor for a phalanx of warriors fighting on foot. The Mozarab Chronicle also makes it clear that the Franks were highly disciplined. For 7 days, Charles held his position, refusing to be drawn out by the skirmishing of the Arabs. Finally, when Al-Rahman launched his cavalry, an uphill attack, the Franks cut down and destroyed the Arab forces. Frankish discipline is also shown in their conduct after the battle. Far from being a sign of weakness, the hesitance of the Franks to pursue the defeated Arabs indicates a disciplined and experienced army. Given a little success, an ill-disciplined force is prone to break up and rush after plunder, only to be ambushed by a hidden detachment of their foes. Martel's men refrained from such recklessness. Only in the morning, when it was confirmed that the enemy had been destroyed, did Charles allow his troops to plunder the Muslim camp. Both accounts also agree that Al-Rahman was slain in the fighting. This points to the scope of the Frankish victory. This was a large-scale and serious defeat for the Umayyads. Even during the 8th century, Martel's victory at Tours became widely known and celebrated. Within a few years, in faraway Northumbria, the Venerable Bede had heard of the battle and remarked, "The Saracens, who had devastated Gaul, were punished for their perfidy." The Battle of Tours has long been the subject of intense study and discussion. On the one hand, it has been regarded as a key victory for Christendom over Islam, which prevented France from falling to the Muslim forces that had absorbed Spain. On the other hand, some commentators have argued that the Umayyad Caliphate had reached a natural limit in Spain and lacked the resources to dominate France. 2 years later, a Muslim army again ravaged the Rhone Valley, capturing Arles and Avignon. But Charles Martel again marched out and pushed them back into Narbonne. Martel and his troops then defeated an Arab relieving force dispatched from Spain. Nevertheless, the defeat of the Muslims at Tours in 732 effectively marked the end of large-scale Umayyad raids into France. It was clear that they would not be able to easily conquer or even continue raiding the region. Charles Martel and his Franks were a force to be reckoned with and a serious deterrent to future Umayyad commanders. But also, the Muslims were short of manpower, since the North African and Spanish conquests had stretched their resources thin. Civil conflict within the Emirate of Cordoba would weaken Muslim rule in Septimania. Martel's son, Pepin the Short, captured Narbonne from the Umayyads in the 750s. With that, Muslim rule was extinguished in France, and the Franks were now positioned to push into northeastern Spain. Real Crusades history is teaming up with ChristianChannel.com. The Christian Channel provides the very best Christian content, supporting thousands of movies, children's programs, and other entertainment. The Christian Channel is also the home of Knights of the Cross, an upcoming live-action historical drama series about the Crusades, written by yours truly, J. Stephen Roberts. If you pre-order a subscription now to ChristianChannel.com using the promo code KNIGHTS, you'll get 10% off, plus your contribution will go straight toward funding Season 1 of the series. Click on the link down below for details, and don't forget to use the promo code KNIGHTS. In the middle of the 8th century, events in the wider Muslim world had a dramatic impact on Islamic rule in Spain. The Umayyad dynasty, which had ruled Islam since 661, was overthrown in 750 by the Abbasids, who ruthlessly hunted down their rivals. However, one Umayyad, Abd al-Rahman, grandson of the Caliph Hisham, escaped the Abbasid swords. He fled across North Africa and then established contacts with his family's partisans in Spain. By August 755, al-Rahman was assembling an army and preparing to establish his power on the Iberian Peninsula. However, the current governor of Al-Andalus, Yusuf, was on the verge of establishing himself as an independent ruler. He had no intention of surrendering power to al-Rahman. The decisive encounter came when al-Rahman marched with an army on Cordoba. The two Muslim rivals met in battle outside the city on May 15, 756. Yusuf's army was destroyed. Abd al-Rahman marched triumphant into Cordoba, where he proclaimed himself emir. The era of an independent emirate of Cordoba had begun. Over the next 30 years, Abd al-Rahman worked diligently to secure his position. He invited refugee Umayyads to Spain, showering them with favors. He organized an army of mercenaries loyal only to him. Initially, the Berbers supported him, but they eventually rebelled, becoming the chief anxiety of his reign. Berber guerrilla attacks would plague the emir until 776. During this period, the tiny Christian state of Asturias scarcely snagged the emir's notice. However, during this period, the Asturian kingdom developed both territorially and culturally. Christian refugees from the sprawling Muslim lands continued to trickle northward, growing the populations of Asturian villages. Abbots and monks arrived from the Muslim cities and settled as whole communities in Christian territory. The growing self-confidence of Asturias was manifested in Oviedo, where one Abbot Maximus founded an important monastery in 761. Far more dangerous to Cordoba's power were independent Muslim lords in their frontier fortresses, especially in the northeast. Governors in Zaragoza, Barcelona, and Girona had long tried to hold Cordoba's authority at bay. Now they could proclaim the emir as an unlawful rebel against the Abbasid Caliph. Abbasid agents approached Suleiman, ruler of Zaragoza, who agreed to collaborate with them. Seeking other allies to bolster his rejection of Umayyad dominion, Suleiman even appealed to one of the major Christian powers of the era, Charlemagne, king of the Franks. Suleiman traveled to Paderborn, where he promised to submit Zaragoza to Frankish overlordship. Charlemagne welcomed this appeal. His concerns lay chiefly in Germany and Italy, but this seemed to be an opportunity for a quick success and expansion of his own power. Assembling his army, the Frankish king prepared to march out against the Umayyads and secure Zaragoza for his new Abbasid ally. In May 778, the Frankish army marched south and crossed the Pyrenees. After occupying Pamplona, Charlemagne moved on Zaragoza, but the city gates remained closed to him. Husayn ibn Yahya, Suleiman's lieutenant left in charge of the city, reneged on Suleiman's terms and chose to resist the Franks. Although Charlemagne's army was not equipped for a long siege, the Franks did make an attempt on the city. Zaragoza held out. Charlemagne at last gave the order to withdraw, destroying Pamplona on his way back. On August 15, 778, Charlemagne's army was at Roncesvalles. Thick forests covered the jagged hillsides. So narrow was this pass that the Frankish army was strung out for miles in thin columns. From the ledges above, a force of Basques hid and watched. They waited until twilight, when the bulk of the army had moved through the pass, then fell upon the rearguard, peppering them with boulders and arrows. As the rearguard broke in confusion and was separated from the main army, the Basques rushed upon them. Though the Franks stood and fought fiercely, the Basques overwhelmed them. It was in this ambush that died Roland, lord of the Breton Marches. Roland's heroism at this impossible moment would become the stuff of legend in European literature. By the time Charlemagne realized what had happened, it was over, and the Basques had vanished into the night. The epic Song of Roland records Charlemagne's lament over the loss of his friend and comrade. "My friend Roland, God lay your soul on flowers, in paradise with all the glorious host. You came to Spain with a cruel overlord. No day shall pass henceforth that I'll not mourn." Charlemagne's Iberian campaign was a rare disappointment in his long career of triumphs. Abd al-Rahman benefited the most from it. After the departure of the Franks, Husayn killed Suleiman, just before Abd al-Rahman arrived with a vast Umayyad army to subdue Zaragoza. Once the city fell, Husayn was dragged before the emir and executed for rebellion. Zaragoza became the emir of Cordoba's most important northern fortress. However, Frankish designs on the Iberian Peninsula continued. Charlemagne realized that progress on his southern border would require a bit more patience. He captured Girona from the Moors in 785. This was the first step in the Frankish advance toward Barcelona. 3 years later, in 788, Abd al-Rahman, emir of Cordoba, was dead. A ruler of remarkable energy and foresight, he succeeded in carving out an independent and powerful Umayyad Spain, despite Abbasid opposition. He also laid the groundwork for Cordoba's future glory as one of the jewels of the Muslim world, beginning work on the Great Mosque. Despite his success, he refused to take on the title of Caliph, and his successors would shrink from such an assertion for almost 200 years. For the time being, the Abbasid Caliph was commemorated in the Mosque of Cordoba. The new emir was al-Rahman's son, Hisham I, who took the throne in 788. Renowned for his piety and his charitable works, his reign was a period of general stability. A well-educated ruler, Hisham cooperated closely with the Malikite jurists, who adopted a rigorous approach to the Quran and law. The Malikite school came to dominate the juridical and theological thought of the emirate, wielding great influence in public affairs. General peace in the Muslim domain allowed Hisham to dispatch annual raiding parties into the Christian north. These raids were devastating to the rural, penurious Christian territory. Asturian forces were often hopelessly outmatched. Towns were left ruined, and thousands of Christians were taken as slaves into Umayyad territory. So overwhelming was Muslim military power at this time that the Asturian king, Ramur, abdicated in favor of his cousin, Alfonso II, known to history as the Chaste. Alfonso II has long been regarded as one of the outstanding monarchs of the Asturian era. He certainly assumed the throne during a period of crisis, and he proved himself in the face of trial. In 794, two separate Umayyad armies entered Asturian territory, ravaging Álava and Oviedo respectively. Alfonso II rallied his forces. He met the Muslims in battle at Los Lodos and defeated them, slaying the Moorish general Abd al-Malik. Determined to avenge this loss, Hisham dispatched another army against Asturias in 795. The Muslims ravaged central Asturias, while Alfonso was forced to retreat with his troops into the Nalón Valley. The Umayyads returned again in 797 to raid Castile. In 796, Hisham died. He was succeeded by Al-Hakam I, whose reign would provide a respite to the Christian north from the incessant raids of the Umayyads. For Al-Hakam's rule was a period of turbulence for the Emirate of Cordoba, plagued by rebellions from the powerful Muslim lords on the frontiers. Thus, after 797, Cordoba was less capable of dispatching large raiding expeditions into Christian territory. I am creating a live-action historical drama TV series about the Crusades called Knights of the Cross, available exclusively on the new streaming service, christianchannel.com. You guys can help us make it happen. Click the link down below, go to christianchannel.com, sign up for a 1-year subscription. Use the promo code KNIGHTS, you'll get 10% off, plus your subscription goes straight toward helping us fund Knights of the Cross. This is an exciting project. This is our chance to finally create an accurate and powerful portrayal of the Crusades. Help us make it happen. Click the link down below.